Hi, this is CommieCast, the podcast that talks about the issues that matter to you. I'm Stewart McGill from the Communist Party of Britain. I'm joined by my comrade Stephanie Martin up in Glasgow. Tonight we're going to be talking about Johnson's levelling up agenda and what it really means. Stephanie, tell us about yourself at first.
Hello Stuart, good to be here. I'm a party member in the Glasgow branch. I'm also a member of the YCL in the Glasgow branch. I've got a keen interest in progressive federalism as a third option to the issue of Scottish independence. And I've attended a number of meetings on the subject. So I'm here, I'm ready to speak about it.
Okay, good stuff. And when you say progressive federalism, I just, as a wee aside maybe, but it'll be useful for people who are listening to this and maybe aren't familiar with the term. What does progressive federalism mean to you?
To me, it's about extending democracy across the UK. I think part of the thirst for Scottish independence is a feeling that there is no democracy in Scotland. And I think that's based in an aspect of reality, but it's not just applied to Scotland, it's actually felt across the UK. So progressive federalism would be about maybe real levelling up for working people, as opposed to what Johnson's idea of levelling up would be, that would have to be done by working people for ourselves, that would increase the democratic power of working people up and down the country.
Right, that's actually very interesting. So that takes us nice and seamlessly into the first question we had down here. What do communists in Scotland think of Johnson's levelling up agenda?
Well, I'd say the short answer is that it's a thinly veiled attempt to centralise power with the Conservative government, while subjecting workers to rampant exploitation in the interests of multinational businesses, pretending to respond to the demands for extending democracy, and pretending to respond to the critical issue of regional inequality. And in fact, Boris Johnson won the 2019 general election by promising to deal with regional inequality, using this jingoistic idea of levelling up. Johnson claimed he would level up the north of England and other areas where things like employment, wage levels, social services and life expectancy have been far below those in the sort of southeastern region. And as a result of these promises, Labour's Red Wall collapsed. The Corbyn manifesto was defeated, and Johnson entered Parliament with a massive majority. And so now we've got this white paper on how Johnson would see levelling up being done. And I think in order to fully understand the idea of levelling up, you kind of need to look back at what the Corbyn Labour Party were thinking of doing to challenge regional inequality. And the Labour Party said then in 2019 that the real problem was that firms in the old industrial areas weren't able to invest due to the way that they're owned. Dominant shareholdings have been held by finance companies, and the success of those has been measured by how much profit they extract for their wealthy investors, which leaves little or nothing for investment in general. So wealth's being sucked into the City of London and being extracted from the regions. And in January 2022, the TUC's report on investment shows that this has got worse since 2019. Labour saw the answer as public ownership and economic democracy, looking at taking key industries like buses, trains, the post and telecommunications into public ownership. Things like a state investment bank should be taking out shareholdings, and every major company trade unions would have seats on the board as well. And this would ensure that workers were protected and their communities were protected. I think the Labour government was also saying that central government should introduce a taxation system to redistribute wealth from the southeast to the north, and into Scotland and Wales and as well, and that councils would be given new powers for community wealth building. There's quite a lot of literature on community wealth building within the Labour Party, actually. It's quite interesting. And so in response to that, big business and the big business-owned press subjected Corbyn and his Labour Party to a campaign of just outright abuse. And this led to Johnson winning the election on a kind of reverse, almost complete opposite idea of levelling up, but based on the same principles of challenging regional inequality.
Certainly the abuse given to Corbyn after the 2017 election result, whenever they believed he actually had a chance of winning, was extraordinary and quite unprecedented. I've seen this phrase somewhere, I think it's in the white paper, that all this levelling up, unleashing the power of the private sector to unlock jobs and opportunity for all. Now, the private sector is that which has given us the mess we're in just now. Can you kind of translate that for us? What do they actually mean by that?
Well, I guess the main leashes that Johnson would be referring to, that he wants to unleash, would be those parts of the public sector that are still publicly owned and run. Just for example, in Scotland, the Lothian buses in Edinburgh City Council are still publicly owned. But Johnson has a centralising agenda, which, as I said, is thinly disguised by this idea of empowering local governments and regional mayors to invest in local economies. I think you're right to point out that the unleashed private sector has originally brought us these problems. If you just look at the EU over the past 50 years, it's minimised public sector intervention in terms of economic and social provisions, while at the same time empowering big business monopoly consolidation. But obviously these weren't the issues that Johnson and his ilk had with the EU. And so the Tory government's idea of Brexit and their subsequent levelling up agenda will also do nothing other than incorporate and further the agenda of big business into British law, using multinational contractors in these so-called free ports. And I think similarly, if Scotland was to become independent, the SNP would have got no qualms about replicating the EU's sort of procurement framework and economic agenda. The Red Paper Collective's pamphlet on a third option, rather than yes or no to independence, describes this idea of flex security within an independent Scotland under the SNP, which would see no security for workers but competitive taxation policies for businesses. And so I think the idea of unleashing the private sector is essentially jingoistic and heavily ideological. I think what we need instead is to expand social ownership and to plan the economy in order to enable economic development across the nations and regions of the UK. John Foster's pamphlet actually on progressive federalism is a good read for a discussion on like the way that language within neoliberal ideology works, and he analyses the language of freedom within that context really well.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend people to have a look at that pamphlet. I'll stick up information about the pamphlet, how to get hold of it, in the website, which will accompany the podcast. I think it's also important to note that when people talk about the private sector being unleashed, etc., the period just after World War II, say from 45 through to 1980, when there was government intervention and high taxation on the higher paid, growth then was significantly higher per capita than it has been in the neoliberal period since 1980. So this idea that you need an unleashed private sector with low taxes to achieve growth is just nonsense. Again, I'll put some information about that up into the website there. So, given all this, how would you characterise Johnson's programme now that it's finally been announced?
Well, the plans that Johnson and Gove have got are like really detailed, but they are, I think, categorised as the exact reverse of what was proposed by Corbyn and the Labour Party in 2019. Instead of giving workers, local government and local communities democratic powers over business, the plans are to do the exact opposite and give business power over local government, local communities and public services. Instead of redistributing power to the nations and regions, it's more about centralising power at Westminster, and to strip the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate of powers granted to it in, I think, 1998. So in the Levelling Up white paper, and in some of the Conservative Party's previous policy announcements, billions of pounds are being allocated to this levelling up, but the money's always conditional on these public-private partnerships within local government and city and regional mayors' powers. And so the white paper, like as you said, puts it so plainly that the idea is to unleash the power of the private sector to unlock jobs and opportunity for all. But that's the reverse of the Corbyn programme, and I think that is the best way of characterising it.
I see something here. Where do I find this? Oh, yeah, is this something actually in the white paper? Or have the Tories just said this? That accessing the cash requires local government and public service providers to form partnerships with businesses at local level. Could there be, by any chance, you think, any prominent Tory donors amongst these companies that will benefit?
Well, I did a bit of research into that because I suspected as much, and it was difficult for me to find specific Tory donors, but there's no doubt that there will be some, because as we know from the example set by the pandemic, and as reported by the Morning Star, there was £2 billion worth of crony contracts awarded during the pandemic by the Tory party. But what I did find out is that there are 22 out of 26 places that have been awarded these funds, which are represented by Conservative MPs. Just to give a couple of examples, Sajid Javid's constituency has received 14.5 million, and Nadine Dorry's constituency has received 26.7 million. And in fact, there's now been a legal challenge launched into this by the Good Law Project with permission from the High Court, because it seems pretty clear that the agenda here isn't to actually level disparities across the regions and areas of this country. It's to entrench Conservative power and strengthen their political base. Yeah, there's clear cronyism going on here. I think it will just become more apparent as the money's rolled out.
Yeah, that's no surprise, really, given their record during the pandemic. So, again, given all this, what do you think the impact on working class communities is going to be? Certainly in the light of the ongoing inflationary crisis as well. Talk to us about that too, please.
So on top of the 4.5 billion for the administration of the Levelling Up programme, 4.8 billion is also going to go for infrastructure investment, another 26 billion for the so-called Green Industrial Revolution, 5 billion for broadband, 3.8 billion for a regional investment bank, and 1.4 billion for city region deals. That's just an eye-watering amount of money. Accessing this cash is requiring local government and public service providers to form these partnerships with businesses at a local level, really shackling the potential of local democracy for the working class. And cynically, the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate are being cut out of this deal. The links must be made directly at a local community level. This is combined with a drive to remodel and debase basically what remains a local democracy itself. Instead of elected councils with councillors directly responsible to local wards, the government wants every region to have an elected mayor or governors. It wants these new structures in place within 7 years. The job of these mayors will probably be to look to the private sector for investment, and to do so in line with the partnership deals that are being decided by the central government at Westminster. And that's Johnson's idea of levelling up. It is a cynical attempt to head off the demands of trade union movement and of the Corbyn Labour Party agenda for real economic democracy, while also trying to pretend to tackle the issue of regional economic inequalities.
So as I understand from what you're saying so far, this is basically an attempt to go ahead and consolidate the power of private capital across the regions, and to put all the money available basically into the pockets of the private capital concerned, and will undermine local democracy in doing what should be done up there.
Yeah, totally. I think a good example of that is probably just thinking about this idea of free ports. I think these have already been established in England, but in Scotland are going to be called green free ports, even though the Green Party itself has described them as a capitulation to corporate interest. And just for those who don't know, free ports are it's a zone which are freed from so-called burdensome regulation and taxes. It means that manufacturers in free ports can import raw materials tariff-free, only paying tariffs on the finished products that are leaving the site to go elsewhere in the UK. It means they also don't need to pay, I think they pay lower rates on national insurance if they take on new staff in the areas. But obviously the main problem with these free ports is that they decrease the revenue that governments can actually extract from trade. But also the TUC has called these a potential Trojan horse for watering down employment protections as well. And there's actually no evidence that they create jobs or even stimulate economic growth either.
Now that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard before about green ports that they don't make any real difference. They are basically a bit of a cover for deregulation, and deregulation generally means more money in the hands of people that have it already and more share buybacks, etc., not necessarily stimulating economic growth. There is this idea that the Tories like to give out that tax cuts for wealthy people lead to economic growth. That is not necessarily the case at all. In fact, the evidence shows otherwise. Tell me, what did the SNP say about all this?
Well, the SNP, like I say, in Scotland are going to be called green free ports. So I think it is a bit of greenwashing, which the SNP are quite want to do. And I think there's definitely an alignment with EU neoliberal policy when it comes to the SNP's agenda. Like I said earlier about this idea of flexicurity, it's about creating some sort of competitive taxation arrangement for private businesses while not securing workers and their employment rights. So I think that if you want to understand the SNP's agenda, you need to look no further than what's going on across the EU just now.
Okay, that makes sense. So the SNP, you're saying, is basically a big fan of NATO and a big fan of the EU. And of course, these days, the EU is a kind of wee subsidiary of NATO anyway.
Yeah.
All right. So to this levelling up, when it first came out, I had the impression, along with some other people, that it was going to be about actually increasing or decreasing the levels of inequality within regions as well as between the regions. But I don't think that has anything to do with it. Is that right?
Well, when you read the white paper, there's quite a concerted emphasis on expanding equality of opportunity across the country rather than any sort of idea of material inequality. It says while talent is spread equally across our country, opportunity is not, and levelling up means giving everyone the opportunity to flourish. And in fact, seeing the executive summary document is 17 pages long, and the word opportunity is used in exactly that context 12 times. So I think they put across a very simplistic perspective of what inequality is and how it's actually experienced across the UK, as if there are some regions which are just universally poorer than others, with the south east of England being some sort of over-concentrated hub of economic growth and higher productivity. But this doesn't acknowledge the fact that London itself has some of the most impoverished communities existing within it, despite being right next to this World Economic Centre. And so part of this levelling up involves like a social value award criterion to procurement. And this essentially just means that there's additional value that a business can bring in delivering a contract to the wider community or public, which would extend beyond the actual monetary value of the contract itself. And they've said that there needs to be like a 10% aspect of finance into the local community, and that would be done through, Justine Greening has said in our document, Levelling Up Goals, that this would be done through things like apprenticeships, environmentalism, promoting local entrepreneurialism, widening access to education, things like that. So this is going to benefit businesses that are already really good at selling themselves as having some kind of greater social purpose. And it's going to force businesses that aren't already modelled like that to become modelled like that. And to me, it just seems like an attempt to portray a friendly face to capitalism while entrenching it deeper within local economies and local governments.
And there'll be certainly no effort made to increase real wages and to stop corporates actually doing share buybacks with all the money they've made from their inflationary pay increases, their inflationary price increases. What's going to happen to the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate? Are there plans to increase their powers, or are they going to be cut?
I think it will definitely be a cut, just going by the trend so far. Since Brexit, there's already been a reacquisition of powers to the Westminster Parliament from the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate, that the money is going to be going directly from Westminster to these non-elected city region cabinets, and these are going to be responsible for developing regional partnerships with businesses. And at the same time as that, direct funding for Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate is being cut, and powers over state aid for industry and public procurement are being centralised back to Westminster. And this is taking away the powers that were granted in 1998 at the establishment of the devolved administrations.
So basically, you're going to have these unelected bodies are going to be responsible for distributing government largesse to companies, many of whom are Tory donors.
Yeah, essentially. It is entirely undemocratic.
Right. This sounds even worse than I thought, I have to say. So, what do communists say we should do about this?
Well, we're calling on the trade union and labour movement to back a radical alternative, one that tackles Johnson head on and directly using the language of levelling up to project a real alternative. Across Britain, our demand is for a comprehensive plan to decentralise power away from Johnson's big business state and to challenge its anti-democratic character and put out a public sector alternative. I think this is especially important given the way that the Tory government is wrapped up in constant scandal. This requires a new type of federalism, one that's going to reinvigorate our democracy and progressively redistribute wealth and power, while at the same time mobilising the power of the working class people. So we call for regional assemblies in the English regions and also Cornwall. These assemblies should be directly elected. They should also have power over state aid and public procurement that will enable intervention economically to rebuild regional industries and to develop public services. This will restore democratic public control over the services we really need, like care for the elderly, transport, housing, education, and industrial training. We also call for the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate to regain their original powers over industrial policy and to secure the kind of borrowing powers for investment that's going to actually enable them to fund industrial growth under democratic control. And a part of this is also a rejection of the proposals for these, in Scotland, are called green free ports, as schemes that are only going to lead to corporate enrichment at the expense of genuine democratic planning. The Communist Party calls this alternative perspective progressive federalism. And this is what we argue the only way of exposing Johnson's policies for what they are, a cynical rerun of Thatcher's privatisation drive, this time directly attacking what remains of democracy at a local, regional and national level. And so the only way to see levelling up for working people is for this to be done by working people. We want a new progressive federalism, one that progressively increases the democratic power of the working people of Britain. And I think importantly as well, we need to think about the way that trust in our democracy has just been diminished over the past recent years. I mean, I was reading today that I think it's like 70% of the public don't feel that democracy doesn't work well in Britain. And I read on the Carnegie Trust that, interestingly, trust in public services like doctors and transport services are still quite high. They're up at 70%. So this is an important starting point for us to build that radical alternative that is rooted in the trust of the working class.
I think it's very important that we do that. I think it's also important that we re-establish a certain sense of hope. I think a lot of people sound quite cynical about politics because they've given up. They genuinely believe there is no alternative, and if somebody else comes in, they'll be the same. There is this kind of feeling of lack of power and lack of influence over the great leviathan of politics. And I can understand why people feel that way, but we can't afford to act that way, because then nothing will get done. And as you've made very clear tonight, there is an awful lot to be stopped. One last point I want to make myself. You talked about productivity earlier on, and the southeast of England being the place where everybody thinks all the money is made. That is partly because the City of London is based down there, and the City of London does generate in itself a reasonably large amount of GDP. But the city isn't it, and we talked about this a wee bit earlier on, The city tends to have a very short-term perspective, and that short-term perspective in industry is one of the reasons why we have the regional inequality in the first place. I think you made this point in your introduction. So when people look at the basic figures about the Southeast London and the city having all that productivity, they also act as a serious brake upon that activity. There was some research, I think, done by the Sheffield University political economy unit a few years ago, which showed that the City of London actually cost the country a 4 or 5 trillion pounds over the last 15, 16 years. I'll dig that stuff out and I'll stick it in the website for this podcast. Stephanie, very interesting, very nicely delivered. Any final remarks before we have to say cheerio?
Just thank you for having me on here to discuss this. I think, especially in Scotland, the idea that the national question is a really divisive one. And we as communists have got the most important task of uniting the working class and building class consciousness. And I think progressive federalism would be a fantastic way to start doing that.
I hope you're right, because I certainly, I mean, Scottish nationalism to me is against pretty much everything that we believe in. I can understand why people in Scotland ain't too keen on the government that the English vote for, but if they were to go independent and join the European Union, that's no independence whatsoever, and will do nothing for the Scottish working class. Right, Stephanie, thank you very much indeed. This has been CommieCast. We are anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, but very much pro the working class, and the working class from all the countries that make up Britain, and indeed the rest of the planet. Thank you very much for listening. Good night.